Well, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to talk about a favorite subject. I have found in doing Civil War presentations, most people know very little about what the Navy did during the Civil War. They might have heard of the Battle of the Monitor and the Merrimack, and that's about it, or the blockade was bad. But you ought to feel, there was an oceanic branch, the deep ocean people that, they were blockading the ports and capturing the ports and so forth. There was a lot of river activity, and Cincinnati was kind of the center of that. And so my talk here is to honor those folks who fought during the Civil War for the Union. And because of their contributions, Grant and Sherman were successful in the Western Theater, as it was known then, the river system, basically. So what you see here on the screen is a lithograph, or an old diagram of the earliest warships. They were timberclads, they were called, and they're being fitted out on the river just a little bit north of the downtown of Cincinnati. So you could say, oops, you could say for a limited period of time, Cincinnati was a Navy town in a limited area where this happened. But I want to talk to you about what the missions were for the Navy on the Western waters, as it was known at the time. They had to fight a new kind of war because they didn't have warships for fighting on rivers. They're ocean warships. And they had two broad missions: opening the rivers to commerce and then holding the rivers once they captured them. And there were several local heroes that I want to give some credit to. And then I'll summarize at the end. Why this topic? Well, I was in the Navy for about 5 years. It was a time of transition. I guess it's always a time of transition. They went from bunker C, which is like asphalt fuel for old destroyers, to nuclear power. Battleships were the big deal during World War II with their big guns. And I was on a missile submarine that carried 16 missiles. So back in the 70s, this was a change. And I wondered, what was it like? My ship had been designed in the 60s. And I wondered, what was it like 100 years before for people in the Navy? So that's what got me interested in it. Well, let's set the scene a little bit. The Civil War started, and General Winfield Scott, who was 75 years old, he was too big and heavy to be able to command. He was too old too. He came up with a broad strategy of surround the South like a great snake, was his term, and strangle it. And the press picked that up and called it the Anaconda Plan. I don't think he ever called it that. That's although the Union government never officially adopted it formally, that's what they did by what they did, because they had to cut off the South from outside sources of food, and well, not food so much as military supplies. And in doing so, this was America's first 600-ship Navy. The circled area is where we're going to talk about where the River Navy did its operations to help with that blockade. Well, the broad missions are to reopen the river, and it took 2 years to do that because the North was basically being blockaded from shipping its goods to the ocean because the Mississippi River was held by the Confederacy. So the plan was to build and crew warships that could fight and capture forts and also bring supplies and fight other ships. The Confederates didn't have a lot of ships, but they did have some. It was important for the Army and the Navy to cooperate, and that's oftentimes thought to be an oxymoron. But they did do that. The Cincinnati provided a large share of these kinds of ships, and I've got a convention in all these slides. If you see a name highlighted in yellow of a ship, it was from Cincinnati. So there were a lot of these ships. Once they'd managed to get hold of the river, then they needed a different kind of warship to fight the guerrilla bands and the partisan bands and to help convoy supplies to where they were needed. So more than half of these were supplied by Cincinnati as well. And we'll talk about what kind of ships were they in a bit. You might wonder why the title Webbed Feet. Well, let's put some context on Abraham Lincoln wrote a friend, James Conkling, in August of 1863. And he talked about the webbed feet. And the reason there's some context here, July of 1863, Gettysburg was captured by the Union, Vicksburg was captured by the Union, and the John Hunt Morgan raid, which I'll talk about more later, had been broken up in July. So there was a lot happening, and the Navy played a role in two of those three things. So he thought, nor must Uncle Sam's webbed feet be forgotten, At all the watery margins, they have been present, not only on the deep sea, the broad bay and the rapid river, but also up the narrow muddy bayou and wherever the ground was a little damp, they have been and made their tracks. And that's only a little bit of an exaggeration. There were some shallow waters that they ran in. The western rivers the western waters were the Mississippi River and all the rivers that flow into it. So we'll see some of the major rivers when we go. And the web feet could go to a lot of places. Well, the River Navy got started in Cincinnati. James Eads, who was a well-known engineer and river pilot and salvage person in St. Louis, went to his friend Edward Bates, who worked for Lincoln as Postmaster General, and advocated a river warfare strategy. This is just 2 months after the war started. So Bates arranges a meeting with Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy, and he agreed with that. But he had a problem. He only had his Navy was very limited in size at this point. The Navy only had like 7,500 people, about 50 ships, 750 officers, and half of those officers went south. So he only had 350 officers. So what he did do was he sent an experienced officer, Commander John Rogers, to Cincinnati because General McClellan's headquarters was there. And General McClellan had all kinds of money. And so Commander Rogers started spending General McClellan's money to outfit ships to fight. And you might wonder, well, why Cincinnati? Well, there was critical river infrastructure here. We had experienced riverboat men, 6 steamboat building yards. In Cincinnati, there were 22 steam machinery companies, a lot of foundries and machine shops, and raw materials were close by. The Hanging Rock Iron region had iron that even was used to build the Monitor a little bit. And a lot of coal. So that was important. And of course, there were many steamboats that were idle right now because of the fact they couldn't travel up and down the Mississippi River. So there was a lot of opportunity in Cincinnati. Well, Commander Rogers was used to ocean-going ships. And when he saw the stuff in the rivers, he was shocked because ocean-going ships are big. You know, they're built of tree trunks, like this cross-section of a ship, heavy framing. They're built to resist what's called hogging, when the middle of the ship is pushed up from below, and sagging when the ends of the ship are held up, because you got to have some rigidity or the ship's going to break in half. And of course, they put the boilers and the engines below the waterline to make them safe, and screw propellers were used in the ocean. Well, he had a shock when he saw what was going on in the rivers. Here's the only picture I could find, Cincinnati in 1884, and the river is really low here. And so it was very shallow water commonly. In the upper parts of the river, you might be trying to run in 1.5 to 2 feet of water, which is not very much. So I thought it was kind of funny when they found this line of braggadocio, bragging about how they could operate in shallow water. Our ship was built so that in a low river, her first mate could tap a keg of beer and run 4 miles on the suds. So I thought that was pretty good braggadocio. Anyhow. They had to build them differently. They were shallow, they were weak, they were lightly built, so they were weak, thin wood, very easy to break apart. They had to have structural elements just to hold the thing in its shape. And an ocean-going ship has a length to width of something like 10 or 11 to 1. River-going ships don't need to be that long, and they're usually 3.5 to 1 or so. So they got narrow, they got bow. The rivers are narrow, and so they had to arm them with bow guns as well as broadside guns. And my analogy is riverboats would be fighting almost like they're fighting in an alley because it's a narrow channel. So they had to build these ships with structure. And he had to get used to river nomenclature, that they weren't stacks, they were chimneys. And the decks were called different things. And the pilot house was where the control occurred. They were shallow, very weak. And you might have these things pointed out with arrows here are the support, they call them hog chains. It has nothing to do with the pig. It's just to prevent hogging, the sagging of the ends away from the middle. So there's this bridge up at Carillon Park in Dayton that looks like this a little bit, to show you that I kind of think of these riverboats as being sort of like a bridge that could float. You can see that you need the structure to keep the ends from sagging. And there's a lot of weight. That's why they had to worry about it. They also had to contend with 2 different ways. It split about 50-50. There were side wheel boats, which the Navy liked because they had more maneuverability. You could run one wheel forward and the other going aft in reverse and turn the boat in the river. But those wheels were vulnerable. The stern wheels were better protected if you ran aground, which happened often in the rivers, but they were hard to maneuver. So if you wanted to do a quick turn around to go the other way, you had to nose into the bank and let the river turn you to run you downstream. So there were advantages and disadvantages of each. Key infrastructure in Cincinnati was the boat building operation. Here's the 6 or 7 major boat yards at the time. And there were many foundries and machine shops there. And just out of curiosity, if anybody listening to this happened to have any ancestors who worked in these industries during the Civil War, I'd be interested in that if you have any papers or letters or anything, because that's kind of interesting story of what it took to make these happen. So with the help of the Cincinnati Library, I went into their picture collection, and this shows how they used to build riverboats. They'd build the frames, and then they'd put a sheathing on the hull with timber, and they'd launch them from the side of the river. They wouldn't build the whole ship. They would build the hull and some of the superstructure. And then after they launched it, whether it was a marine railway, imagine a bunch of slides going down to the river and steam machinery at the top and little platforms, and they would lower the boat down into the water and then lift it up. So that was one way to do it. A common way to launch a boat was end launching, where the ship would be like what you see in the movies and stuff, slides down the rails. Side launching was also done, and I wasn't as familiar with this, but if you want to see an exciting video, just look in YouTube and say Great Lakes side launching, because that's how they do it. And you think the thing is going to totally capsize and roll over, but they don't. They've got it figured out. But they were flimsy and they weren't finished. They were just putting them together. And so then they had to go and add the machinery. Now, you might have seen pictures of walking beam engines, real slow, big ponderous machines, and the beam at the top goes up and down as the pistons go up and down. It turns the wheels. So people thought of this as walking. Well, they were too big and clumsy for the river system. And there's hardly any of the riverboats in this river system. Hudson River in New York used them, but not here. So the much more common thing was a horizontal engine where it's 150 pounds per square inch steam. Your car tire has 30 to 32 for comparison. And it was noisy because they used the steam once and then it shot up a pipe to the top of the ship called the escapement. And you'd hear them coming, chuff, 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 chuff. So it was pretty noisy. But that's how they got around. They worked pretty well. They had to rivet their boilers together. There weren't any really good boiler coats in that day, so a good boiler maker had experience, and that's about it. Fuel, coal versus wood. A lot of people have this romantic notion of the Robert E. Lee and throwing firewood and that kind of stuff. It's in some of the old stories. Coal was a preferred fuel because it was a lot more compact. Here's a picture of an 80-pound bushel, and one person would carry one of these things. And they would find that you could carry, depends on the ship, maybe as many as 2,000 bushels worth, and it's a little over a cubic foot of coal. 10 to 12 bushels of coal was equal to the cord of best wood. So that's like 15 cubic feet versus, here's a cord of wood pictured on the right, 128 cubic feet. So if you compare the savings, there's a lot of difference here. If you compare 50 cords of wood, that's equivalent to 500 bushels of coal. And the 50 cords of wood takes up 6,400 cubic feet, which you probably don't have that room on one of these river boats. And 750 cubic feet, you got room for the coal. So if you went with coal, you had more space for supplies, and it was half the price of wood. So it was a no-brainer at the time. And here we had the southern Ohio is a significant coal region. So the Navy spent a lot of money buying coal during the Civil War. How did they talk to the engine room to say where they wanted to go? Well, they had this series of bells. I was really fascinated by this when I found out what it was. You had a bell, imagine the sound that these different bells could make, kind of a deep sounding bell for one, a higher pitched sounding bell for two, a gong for three, and then a very high bell. I think of Downton Abbey kind of bells, calling the servants. So there was a whole bell pattern. And if you had a side wheeler, it had a port engine and a starboard engine. So they had two sets of bells. And so you'd have to know, to the outsider, it'd be gibberish. But or a friend, Jack White, who wrote the book Island Queen, described it as sounds like a bunch of demented bell ringers. But if you were used to the sound, you'd get used to it, and you would understand what you're supposed to do next. All this confusion was replaced in the 1920s, finally modernized with the engine ordered telegraph. Hey, they've been around since the 1860s, but the river was slow to make change. Signaling was visual. Cell phone coverage was really poor in those days, surprise. And so they had to use sights and sounds to coordinate each other. So here's a bell that you can see on the USS Texas, and they had whistles and there were signals, what it meant. They used lights at night. Here's the lights of the USS Cincinnati. And then to different kinds of signal flags that resemble the ones today. If you want to hold actual artifacts from somebody, Commander William R. Hull, who was a captain of the USS Pittsburgh, put his personal effects in the Cincinnati library. So you can go in the Inland Rivers room and hold this stuff and see it. He made 200 trips up and down the Mississippi River before the Civil War, and then he volunteered to help out. So that was, to get that in place. Now, what am I going to shoot with? Well, there were a series of guns, but you can't have the biggest guns. There were bigger guns during the Civil War, but they were too heavy. Look at the weights of a gun tube. A Dahlgren 8-inch, which is pictured there on the right, it weighed 6,500 pounds, and that doesn't include the carriage. So another 1,000 pounds for that. And so that there was a lot of weight. The most commonly used gun for the tin-clads was a 24-pound howitzer, which was almost portable. So, but you needed this kind of stuff. The Museum Center in Cincinnati has a copy of the 30-pound Parrott rifle. I don't know where they put it. It's not in their landings on the public landing display anymore. But they were big and heavy, and this is the fighting power for these ships. And this is where all the crew members were busy loading and firing these things. Cincinnati contributed, or I should say Ohio contributed about 3,300 sailors to the Navy. They had a naval rendezvous as a term for recruiting center. They were down on the public landing, and then they would advertise in the papers for the U.S. gunboat service, and then the Mississippi Squadron. So they were looking for folks. So you had this kind of area. Of the 3,274 people from Ohio, 1,800 of them were from Hamilton County. Some records that I saw in Columbus one time. So a very high proportion from the river community. If you were around the Cincinnati public landing, you might almost think it was a Navy area. Certainly there's lots of Army uniforms going around, and they wore blue as well. But this was an area where you had the naval rendezvous. The Spencer House was where naval officers went and stayed when they came to Cincinnati. They had a receiving ship, which was the USS Grampus. And when you recruited somebody, you had to teach them basic stuff about the Navy. So they used those ships as training places. And then any ships from the boat yards would come down river and be parked here, and they'd build crews for them. And then they'd send them down river to get the weapons loaded on. So it was a Navy area there. Every day you probably see 2 boats down there. So river sailors had a different job than ocean sailors, because river sailors didn't run at night. It was extremely rare because all the snags in the river, they would have hit something and sunk. So here's a typical tin clad, the USS Queen City. They had basically a daytime thing. You had port and starboard watches, which means 4 hours on, 4 hours off. You'd have reveille and do maintenance kind of stuff, eat breakfast. At least they had fresh food because they're right there around the food supplies. Got the main meal at noon. And this was something that hasn't changed from when I was in the Navy. You spend the whole afternoon drilling and drilling some more, and then you tie up for the night. And on the weekends, you'd have some time off. Of course, sailors initially enlisted thinking it was going to be less hazardous than soldiering, and overall it was, but there were some bad assumptions made because they thought they were a safe distance from enemy, but enemy cannons can fire a couple miles. A strong, safe fighting environment looks strong until a cannonball hits it. They didn't see anybody shot by a bullet, but it was a cannonball that did it. In fact, sailors were kind of grossed out when they heard soldiers ashore talking about death very casually because they didn't see it. And then, but when all hell is breaking loose, what does it mean to be courage, to have courage as a sailor? And it worked out to be that if you stay on your station, despite all hell breaking loose, then that's courage, because what else can you do? So they had to get some purpose-built ships. Now here's one, a River City the ironclads that were, call them casement ironclads. They had like a housing built with a layer of iron over it. It was about 175 feet long, 50 feet beam, weighed about, it had a displacement of about 512 tons. It could operate in 6 feet of water, and the paddle wheels were inside the housing to protect them. It had about 10 guns on them, some pointing forward and the rest pointing to the sides. It carried 255 men or 251 men. So that was pretty crowded when you're underway. Most of the time you're probably tied up, but if you're moving, like in some of the campaigns, that's very crowded because you can't live in the whole length of the space. The only place that most of the crew could live is on the gun deck in the forward part of the ship. So you didn't want to be in the engine room. It was probably 150 degrees from the heat. So it was a crowded environment. These were pretty successful. These actually saw action. They were the first ironclads the Navy had to see action before the Monitor and Merrimack. The first fighting that these ships saw was in February of 1862, and the Monitor fought the Merrimack in March of 1862. So it's just a little bit before. Another kind of ship was a ram. A civil engineer, Charles Ellet, persuaded the Army to buy some fast speed boats and reinforce them the long way on the ship so that it could ram into the side of an enemy ship. It didn't have to poke a hole in it other than just crush the enemy ship's sides. And you needed higher speed ships to do this. Cincinnati, the USS Queen of the West was one of them. And if you go to the public landing Cincinnati Museum Center, that ship's published. That's what's portrayed here. I was disappointed they have nothing there that talks about the military record of that ship, because it did fight on both sides, which you'll hear about later. Then these rams were put into the Ellet Ram fleet, and Ellet's cousin, or his son, I think, was in charge of it. He was an Army general. Well, you know, this divided command thing didn't work that well, but they did do it for a while. And then eventually these came under Navy command so that you have a unified approach to doing things. By 1862, in the middle of the year, they realized they needed shallow draft ships because they were starting to capture territory. So that now they needed to have some folks in ships that could work in the shallow waters. And they needed something, you know, you're talking a couple feet of water at the most. So they called them tin clads. The armor was oak built up with planks, and then something like 1/2 inch or 1 inch iron plate forward on where the guns were and abreast of the boilers to protect the boilers. This was lightly armored. It wasn't tin. I mean, that's just the nickname they gave them. It would stop a bullet, but it wouldn't stop a cannonball from a field gun. So he carried 6 guns, and then they were all painted. And then you can't see the number on this one very well, but there's a number on the pilot house. So at a distance, you can see which one is it. And typically there were about 50 or 60 men on these things. Well, the Union moved pretty quickly at the beginning of the war. This is a very strategic point on the rivers. This is the Mississippi River coming down here. The Ohio River is coming down here. And as the Ohio River comes down here, the Cumberland River comes in and the Tennessee River comes in. And so right here near Paducah, very important. So the Illinois governor sent a couple of regiments of soldiers down at the beginning of the war to hold Cairo, because it was a critical juncture here. And the Union moved to capture the headwaters of these other rivers as well. Paducah was one of the earlier campaigns in the war. So there was a naval station here at Cairo, which I'll show you shortly, and a boat building yard at Mound City. Well, the naval infrastructure they had then, here's the tip of the river, Mississippi here, Ohio there. They had these wharf barges that could go up and down as the river level changed, and the ships would tie up to get supplied or to get weapons loaded on. These are ironclads that are shown here, anchored off in 1863. They fortified this area to fight off any attacks. And so it was an important strategic area. So they got to it before the Confederates did. We needed some naval leaders. Initially, because the Army had the money, it was called the Western Gunboat Flotilla. And up to October 1862, there were naval officers in charge of the ships, but they reported to the Army. And so Commander Rogers was there for a while, but he got into crossways with, I think it was General Fremont, and so he had to leave. Flag Officer Andrew Foote, they didn't call him admirals at the beginning of the war. He was well liked, but he got wounded. He was involved in some of the earlier fighting, got wounded, and later died from his wounds. And then Flag Officer Charles Davis took over up to October of 1862. Congress passed a law putting the Navy in charge of all the ships, and they called it the Mississippi Squadron. And Rear Admiral David Porter, who happened to have an important foster brother, David Farragut, he was in charge of the rivers for 2 years, 1862 to 64. And then he switched roles with the admiral of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, Samuel Lee, who was the third cousin of a certain Robert E. Lee. So all this stuff. The Army did not understand how to use the Navy effectively. They keep, one general would want this one ship to go through, and it wouldn't make it through because it would be captured. Well, June of 61, the Cincinnati Marine Railway launched several timber clads. They didn't have enough iron plate at the time. 5 inches of oak armor, again, protection against bullets, but not field artillery. They carried 6 to 8 guns. They were ready to go 1st of August, 1861. And so Belmont, Kentucky, and Shiloh, these were the only gunboats available. The Battle of Shiloh, which was also known as Pittsburgh Landing, early April, these Cincinnati gunboats saved Grant's left flank because they'd positioned themselves there and kept shooting shells along the trenches that were there, the ditch that was there. Roger Stemble, local guy, was from Miami University, and he was the commander of, I think it was the Lexington. So a bit local kind of stuff. Here's an overview of what happened in the first year of the war. The red shows the river, that was captured during that time. Belmont, Kentucky, over here near Paducah, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson and Nashville. We'll look at these things. So the jaw was starting to close. They made it down to just a little north of Vicksburg in that time. And meanwhile, Admiral Farragut captured New Orleans in the mouth of the Mississippi. So Fort Henry, February 6th of 1862, 4 ironclads and several timberclads attacked Fort Henry, which was on the Tennessee River. It was not a very well situated fort. The Navy defeated it. The Army wasn't quite ready to come ashore, so the Navy took the surrender until the Army arrived. Well, it took them a week to go back up to the Ohio and back down the Cumberland River to get to Fort Donelson. And that was a tougher nut to crack because that was a better built fort. It was up in a hill. Plunging fire hit a lot of the ships, caused a lot of serious injury and damage. The USS Carondelet got hit 54 times, but these ships were able to help subdue the fort. General Grant brought his soldiers ashore and finished the job. The Confederate soldiers, they lost a lot. And this is where Grant got his name as unconditional surrender, because that was his conditions for the Army to surrender. He had a Confederate general who had been a classmate. He thought he'd get a good deal. No, he didn't. So, and the key learning for all this, plunging fire didn't work. I mean, if you don't have armor on top of your ships, it's not going to protect you. So they learned they had to stand back and use their long range capability. So that captured the headwaters for the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, at approximately the Kentucky border, Tennessee-Kentucky border. Out in the Mississippi, they started going down. Island number 10, it was called. It's probably not there. The Mississippi moves so much. But they had the Confederates at a bend in the river set up all these forts to make it hard for the North to go past. And so they lined up all these mortar boats and shot these 13-inch mortar shells for a couple of days. A lot of noise, no effect. The Army had plenty of excess manpower, so they sent their soldiers to cut a canal across this leg to bypass it. The canal worked for the transports, but the military ships were too heavy. So it got to be a standoff. And here we are. Island number 10 is very close to New Madrid, where that big earthquake occurred in 1816. So they're in this bend in the river. So they started softening the place up. Lieutenant John V. Johnston, who is from Maysville and Cincinnati area, led a group of sailors and soldiers and along with the Army was led by a colonel, and they came ashore and spiked the guns. Well, spiking the guns means you take big nails and you drive them into touch holes so you can't actually fire the guns anymore. So they disabled a large share of the guns in the surprise raid one night. And then a little later, the USS Carondelet, who was commanded by Henry Walk, who was from Ohio, they came up with a plan. How are we going to get past here? And First Master William R. Hull, who came from Sharonville, was an experienced pilot. He came up with a plan with the captain and people, and they put a coal barge alongside, and they added extra cable and chain to make a little bit better armor. They took the steam vents from the engine and vented them into the wheelhouse, because remember I was talking about how it went chuff, chuff, chuff going down the river. Well, it would make noise to alert you that somebody's coming if you're trying to do this at night. And then they set up to repel boarders. They had a company of snipers, and they had steam hoses and other weapons. So they were able to run. He ran close to the Confederate batteries. He couldn't depress their guns enough to hit them. And they made it through, and they made it over to New Madrid by midnight. And all of a sudden, the Confederacy has an armored warship below their fortifications. There was a lot of losses. 2 days later, the USS Pittsburgh did the same thing. And so the Confederacy had to pull back from the western end of Kentucky. It turned their flank there. It came with great losses of men and equipment and lots of ammunition. Well, the Confederates were able to strike back. The USS Cairo got sunk in December of 1862 by a torpedo, which is, we call them mines today. And I was curious where the name come from. Well, there's a kind of eel that hides on the bottom. It's called Torpedinidae, and it gives an electric shock. And so somebody had this jokey idea, we're going to call these things that. The Cairo sank. They resurrected it from the ocean or the Yazoo River bottom. You can go see it at Vicksburg, what's left of it. So it was a potent weapon. 28 Union ships eventually during the war were sunk by this kind of weapon. And Cincinnati people survived a lot of the sinking. Well, the second year they had to close the jaw, get this area in blue. So there were battles fought in these locations. The most important ones, well, they had to blockade the Red River, which runs through Louisiana up to Shreveport and on to Texas. So they sent a ram, the USS Queen of the West, down, armored with cotton bales because they didn't have iron on it. And they captured some boats. And then the USS Indianola, which was a Cincinnati-built ironclad, was sent down with coal barges to help. But the Queen ran aground near Fort DeRussy, which they blamed on the renegade pilot, and was captured. And then the Confederacy used the Queen to attack the Indianola, ramming it and damaging it. And so all of a sudden, the Confederacy had two Cincinnati ships. One was used to sink the other. So Porter came up with his great deception. He made up a barge, built some chimneys that burned pitch, and it made it look like an armored riverboat, and he ran it down the river. And it succeeded because the Confederates panicked. They were working on the Indianola. They didn't want to give it back to the Union, so they burned it. And he accomplished his objective. Probably one of the best deceptions of the war. Vicksburg was mostly an Army show when the victory occurred there, but the crossing of the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg down here was the largest amphibious assault until North Africa in World War II. Thousands of men were brought across. And the Navy participated in creating feints and distractions to keep the Confederates off base. But most of the work was done by the Army here for sure. Acting volunteer lieutenant, which was, we would call it Naval Reserve today, but back then it was acting volunteer. He was a captain of the USS Pittsburgh, and Admiral Porter was on the USS Benton, and the steering gear got shot away by some of the firing from Grand Gulf area here, the forts along the shore here. So the ship is drifting and getting hit hard. So Pittsburgh is brought up alongside to stand in harm's way until the Benton could get out of range. So he saved that. And that was an act of bravery. I think a couple people were killed on the Pittsburgh, but it would have been a lot worse without that. Because of that bravery, William Hull was promoted to acting volunteer lieutenant commander, the only one that was done during the Civil War. Last year, the only most of the river was caught, but they sent a raid up the Red River. There was some history why they did it. And although the Battle of Mobile Bay closed Mobile in August of 64, they didn't actually capture the city of Mobile until April of 65. So the Red River campaign in the spring of 1864 was a total fiasco for the Union. It was a political deal rather than a military deal. Grant would rather have captured Mobile. But Lincoln wanted to show that he wanted to control all of Louisiana so it could be readmitted to the Union. He wanted to demonstrate near Texas, which Shreveport was where they were going, that to thwart French ambitions because they were doing stuff down in Mexico while we were busy with the Civil War. And then the Confederates had an ironclad near Shreveport that they weren't sure how strong it was, so they wanted to be well armed. So they took a lot more force than they needed, 104 vessels. And they went up the river, but they weren't paying attention to the river level because the river level was going down. And all of a sudden, you were at risk of losing a good deal of your ships because they'd just be grounded. Well, a lieutenant colonel, you probably heard of this story, Lieutenant Colonel Bailey had a Wisconsin regiment that did logging. And he went to the generals and said, look, I know how to rescue these ships. We'll build a wing dam. So with his regiment and other manpower, they built a wing dam to get the level up and have a high velocity current through. Then nearly all the ships were recovered at this, and he saved the Union's bacon. It could have been pretty disastrous to lose all your ships that way. So that happened. The tin clads were starting to get around. Their USS Rattler was #1 tin clad. It had a checkered career. I mean, it got some kudos for what it did on the Arkansas Post, helping enfilade some enemies. It helped capture the old Confederate ship, the Louisville, which later got renamed to Wachita. But then its acting master, Fentress, was along the river at Rodney, Mississippi, and enjoying the view of the pretty young girls at the church on shore. And they said, well, let's go to church on Sunday. Well, the Confederates had been watching him oogle the gals. And so when they went to church, a couple squads of, I guess, cavalry came up and captured him. And so they were prisoner of war for a while. So what's funny is that he later got reinstated. And although he was dumb to do that, he violated orders. Because he was aggressive, they gave him a command later on after he got out of prisoner of war camp. But then one more incident that occurred in 1864, Acting Master Glennie wants to sell this ship, but his executive officer, the second in command, found out about it, busted the plot. They never found Glennie. He was able to successfully flee. And this ship sank in a storm. So you can see kind of a history of one of the tin clads. There were 76 of them built. So to bring tin clads online, this is where Cincinnati contributed a lot of them. Here's the time frames of these. So there would have been a lot of activity down at the public landing of these ships for crewing and then for transport down the river and to allow to build the armor and the weapons. About 2,300 sailors were brought into the Navy to serve on these ships. So what did they do? Well, main thing was convoy duty to bring supplies. And look at the riverboats lined up here to supply Nashville. And a riverboat could, the river is always going to flow, and they can't stop it. A steamboat could carry 500 tons of cargo, which could feed a lot of men and animals. If you wanted to do it on rail flat cars, you needed 125 of them and 250 wagons. Well, you can't stop the river. You can break, you take 10 feet of track out or you capture a road, you can't supply through that. So it was a real challenge. So you had to have a reliable road, but there were hazards along the way. You'd have a flying battery like this. A tin clad's 1 to 2 inches armor would stop a musket ball, but not a cannonball. So Lieutenant Commander Leroy Fitch set up convoy duty where he would put tin clads at the front and the back and possibly in the middle of a group. And when he did that, and he convoyed the ships, he didn't lose any of the supply ships. He had to keep, because he was only lieutenant commander, he looked like a major to the Army generals, and the Army people were terribly concerned about their rank and position. They wouldn't listen to him, but he was a very responsible Naval Academy graduate. And so he finally got some support from Admiral Porter to stop letting the Army send a single vessel through, because those were vulnerable. But as it was, even with convoys, 6 to 8 tin-clads were sunk by these flying batteries or ran aground. So it was a tough time for that. There's a lot of hazard for the people on the tin-clads. Here's one of those interesting stories. Acting Volunteer Lieutenant John V. Johnston was in command of the USS Forest Rhodes, tin-clad number 9. And he thought he was in a quiet theater of the war down or off of waterproof Louisiana. So he had his wife and his 6-year-old son on board. In February, a group of 800 Confederates were trying to attack and cross a river here. There was a regiment of 300 black soldiers here, and part of their objective was to beat them, and they were not kind to blacks when they captured them. A lot of times they were murdering them. So his boat was there to protect the crossing, and so he would move up and down and fire to keep them away. Well, his 6-year-old son suddenly gets the idea he's going to be a powder monkey, so he runs off, and probably his mother's screaming at him to stop. And a powder monkey would carry ammunition bags of powder from the powder magazine to the guns, and so he could do this. They were often small people, so he did that, and so he wins the recognition as the youngest combatant in the war. And the sailors loved it so much they made him a uniform, as pictured here. And I guess at all the veterans things he went to after the war, he always had free drinks. So there's another person. So here's 2 local heroes. William R. Hull, he was the only volunteer lieutenant commander. And then John V. Johnston had some fame in these couple incidents I've shown you. So how does this fast forward 80 years? Well, the Navy has a tradition of naming ships for naval heroes. And the Battle of Leyte Gulf, MacArthur is invading the Philippines to take them back. And there's a invasion force off of Leyte Gulf, which is right here. And the Japanese came up with a complicated plan. All the aircraft carriers were way out of range, chasing something that was a decoy. And a bunch of battleships came up over the horizon. And these destroyers, which included the USS Johnston and the USS Hull, were there. And they said, oh, shucks, probably more than that. And they looked and they started laying smoke. There were a couple of small aircraft carriers. They did what they could, but they went in on attack mode with torpedoes and guns blazing. The Japanese were kind of confused, and they actually left and went back. And after the war, they were interviewed, and they thought they were being attacked by cruisers, not by destroyers. So, but it cost them. Both of those ships were sunk. And recently I read that the USS Johnston's wreck was discovered on the ocean floor. So there was some real valor there, but the Japanese turned back. Another local hero was Leroy Fitch. He was a Naval Academy graduate. He was the one, I'll talk about the Morgan's Raid work that he did. He was the Navy's expert on Dahlgren boat guns. Here's a picture of one from the Navy Museum in Washington, D.C. And he developed these. They're kind of like field guns, but for the Navy use, they could be carried. They didn't have any horse-drawn versions. So his valor was was rewarded by naming a ship during the Civil War called the USS Fitch. And this ship was doing gunfire support close in, going through the swept minefields up at Utah Beach at Normandy on D-Day in June of 1864. So again, valor would do that. So Fitch had a flagship. And I will talk about the John Hunt Morgan raid. He played a major role in not allowing John Hunt Morgan and his men to escape. He commanded the warlike ship, the USS Moose. You look at these names, and there was the name of the boat before they ironed it, put armor on it. So it was commissioned in May of 1863. It was 155 feet long, 30 foot in beam. It couldn't go that fast. It's about 7.5 miles an hour. And looking at the muster rolls for this particular ship in July of 1863, it had about 64 men. And it carried 6 24-pound Dahlgren howitzers, 24-pound meaning the weight of the shell that it could shoot. So they went through this. I was curious, what's the demographics of a crew of one of these? So Fitch, of course, was the captain, so he's a lieutenant commander. He had an acting ensign. He had a couple acting mates, which is like first lieutenant, or I mean, lieutenant junior grade, and a couple of master's mates. And they had 56 enlisted men on board in this July 1863. They were youngish, 23 years. A quarter of them were foreign born. About 2/3 were Ohio citizens. They had a whole range of previous occupations. So it was really just a cross section of America, just a typical riverboat setup. These muster, if you're into this stuff, muster rolls still exist if you know where to go look for them in the National Archives or online. Well, Fitch knew that this raid was going on. Here's John Hunt Morgan on the red path here, going around to attack and to create all kinds of distractions a couple of weeks after Gettysburg and Vicksburg. So he crosses the river here. The river is in green to give you an idea where the Ohio is. And Fitch has 6 gunboats at his disposal. So he says, well, I'm going to go put them wherever there's a shallow enough area that Morgan could ford the river. So he puts them in 8 Mile Island, and Pomeroy Crossing, and Goose Island. And then he takes the Moose and a support ship, the Allegheny Belle, up to Buffington Island. So that was hard going because the water was shallow. I forgot to mention one thing here on this. John Hunt Morgan figured that he wouldn't have any problem getting across the river when he wanted to because it was summer. The water was too shallow. The Navy couldn't move up there. What he didn't know was that there was rain up country, enough to put water in there and enough for a determined guy who was going to grasshopper his boat over the shallow spots. What's grasshoppering? Well, they have these big poles and they use a capstan to push down, and think of it like crutches to push yourself up over a sandbar. You push up and then you order all ahead full to paddle forward a few feet and repeat, do again and repeat until you get over the sandbar. So that was how they got through. It was hard work. Then they get to the Battle of Buffington Island. And here are the 3 ships in the river. This is Buffington Island right here. And this is the town of Portland, Ohio, a little burg. The battle was fought here. The Confederates thought they could escape across here. The red dashed line is the ford. That didn't work because the Moose got in place about 7:30 and he heard the gunfire. So he positioned himself and he started firing some canister, and that turned the Confederates away. So I was curious to read what did the deck log say for that. And I know you can't read this, but this is what an official deck log looks like. This is the one of that day when the fighting occurred. So there's an entry here. The first one says from 4 to 8 a.m. the weather was foggy. Had an engagement with Morgan's forces and completely routed them. Captured 2 pieces of field artillery, 20 horses, 26 carriages and buggies, and a quantity of dry goods. So they got a lot of the supplies that Morgan was carrying around with him. 4 kegs of powder, canister, and shot in small arms. They shot few shells and shrapnel and canister and a bunch of cartridges. So they were busy chasing that. Then he went up and down the river to keep other Morgan forces from crossing. And then he had a second engagement. So this is what an official deck log, everybody's got them. The captain has to sign off on it. So, or the officer of the deck. So that was a success. Morgan got a lot of, or I should say, Leroy Fitch got a lot of credit. Admiral Porter looked out for him after that, after the war, gave him good assignments. He died at a young age. Let's kind of summarize here. What did the Navy do? The Navy had Cincinnati had a pretty important contribution to the River Navy because it provided about 30% of the military ships and who knows how many civilian transports. The kinds of ships it had, it suffered because there were people killed. The most common death on the river was steam rupture. Cannonball would hit the steam system, and all of a sudden, all this hot water that was at boiling temperature suddenly gets exposed to atmospheric pressure, and it immediately turns to steam. And it can expand some 1,600 times. And a lot of people died of scalding burns. A terrible way to go. 3,200 sailors came from Ohio, and but Cincinnati-built ships suffered, and they were sunk or lost in the action, but they made a major contribution. I've been doing all the talking here. I haven't heard any questions, so let me turn it over for questions, and then I'll talk about the next time I'll be giving a presentation here in the Northern Kentucky History Hour. This is a picture of the USS Cincinnati. There's a model of it. I think it's in the airport concourses today. But it's almost like its namesake of the submarine, the U.S. Cincinnati, because this one was sunk twice and was surfaced twice and reconditioned and reused. So, okay, what questions have you got?
Well, before we get to questions, let's go over the trivia question. And to repeat that, it was, which two Cincinnati area Civil War naval heroes had an impact on the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944? And we did have a winner. That was Matt Whitaker, with William R. Hole.
Hole is how I've heard it pronounced.
And John V. Johnston. So congratulations, Matt. You'll get your prize in the mail. And other than that, we've only had one question so far, I think. And it was, is there a good reference on the construction of the naval ships?
It depends on which ship. There's different. Let me go back to, let me turn this back a bunch of slides. There's some books that have been written about the various kinds of boats that are illustrated here. There's a book on the ironclads. I took this from the cover. It's titled down there at the bottom, Union River Ironclads, Angus Costam. There was a different book about the rams and another one about the timberclads. They were paperback, but those are ones that are there. So that's the riverboats. I don't know if that's the whole question. And certainly there's been books written about just riverboats in general. And most of these tinclads were converted riverboats. You know, they put a little armor on them, took off some of the stuff they didn't need, and that's what they went out to fight with. Okay. Other questions?
Heather, do you see in the Q&A, we've got Marja Barrett said she doesn't have a question, but she says that her uncle was Captain Richard M. Wade. He was master of Queen of the West during the war.
Oh, wow. Well, do you have any, does she have any old letters and things of him?
Marja, that would be great if you could write in the comments and let us know.
And then
what was the name again, just so I can write it down?
Captain Richard M. Wade.
Wade, W-A-D-E?
Yes.
He was what on the Queen of the West?
He was master of Queen of the West during the war.
Okay. So you heard a little history about the boat if he was on it during that time.
And we have had two more questions come in. So are any of the Civil War ships left today? Very few.
You can see ships like this one. If you go to Vicksburg, Mississippi, they at the Vicksburg National Historic Park, they brought the wreckage of the USS Cairo, which was one of these kind of ships. The chief park historian had a hint that it was still there. They dredged it up from the bottom of the Yazoo River, which is near Vicksburg, and brought it ashore. It doesn't look quite like this, but you can get a sense of it because they recreated it kind of like in a skeleton structure. So you can see what it's like. There's, the only other Civil War ship that I can think of right off the top of my head is well, no, there's a couple. There's the USS Monitor, which is in the museum, parts of it in the museum in Newport News, Virginia. And the Confederate submersible, the Hundley, is in Charleston in the old shipyard there. There may be others. I have to think about the question to know. There's not many. There's a few museums that specialize in Civil War Navy. I think there's one in Columbus, Georgia. But there's not many because it's only 55,000 active people compared to 2 million or so soldiers. So, okay, another question, Heather?
Yeah, were there any cities that provided more ships than Cincinnati?
I would imagine if you added up St. Louis and Pittsburgh, they were providing them, and there were other places that built them. Because Cincinnati represented a little, like about half, a little over half. It depends on which kind of ship. The tinclads, which were the later part of the war, they built a lot of them, but the heavier stuff was built in St. Louis and Mound City. Those ironclads like this one, they were built in those areas. These were not built in Cincinnati.
And then Marja Barrett came back and said that her uncle was Richard Marshall Wade, and he came back ill and rebuilt after 2 years. And they've had several reunions at BCM in the last 15 years.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
And then we had another question, which was when they added iron plating to riverboats, did they have to retrofit engines to deal with increased drag?
yes. Well, these gunboats, like what I've got on the screen here, had engines designed for the load. It would have made a difference, but there's probably some compensation because the tin clads, they took some of the deck material off. So they made them more compact deck houses. They weren't 3 levels high, they're just 2. So that, up and plus and minus. So I've never read anything closely to know what the difference in weight was. Good question. It certainly, riverboats don't go that fast because if the current's fast, they barely have headway against it. Most of them couldn't go more than about 6 or 8 miles per hour. So it's slow speed war.
And we did have somebody say that they did get the opportunity to see the USS Cairo a couple years ago in Vicksburg, and that it was fascinating. But other than that, we don't have any other questions.
Okay, well, let me just do a pitch for May 3rd. Let me get to that slide. Most people have heard of the Monitor, the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, or the Virginia, depending on which name you want to give the ship on the left. The Monitor was a unique kind of warship with a revolving turret and 2 kind of cannons in it. It was a very important vessel that these ironclads had a useful purpose in that they never were defeated by a Confederate ironclad, but they weren't very good because they couldn't shoot very fast, which is important. But the point I wanted to make is that the Navy didn't have just one of them. The Navy was so impressed by the performance at the battle in March of 1862, they went out and ordered 35 more of them. So this was one of the first cases of industrialized warfare. And to get them built, they built them in a lot of places around the country. 5 of them were built in the Cincinnati area. And if you come on May 3rd, I'll tell you about it.
Well, we very much enjoyed this presentation, and we look forward to you coming back on May 3rd. So thank you so much, Gary.
Okay, you're welcome.